Another thing we know about people with emerging disabilities, such as these that we're talking about, is they tend to be more likely to be younger and older. They tend to be, they're more likely to be women. They're more likely to be people who represent minority racial and ethnic groups. They're more likely to be living in poverty. I didn't mention multiple chemical sensitivity as a condition, as relatively new, kind of on the scene the last 30 years. You know anyone who's dealing with it, you know that it's real. But the invalidation you experience when you disclose that or try to remove yourself from whatever the irritant would be that your body is, your immune system isn't able to process. So it's this kind of, so people with other disadvantaging characteristics are more likely to deal with these emerging disabilities than they are to deal with other, we won't call them traditional disabilities, but ones that are better understood. There's another category, Andy, you may have some connections with the National Organization for Rare Disorders. And this is a group of advocacy organization on behalf of people who have conditions where there's fewer than, I think it's fewer than 5,000 people in the United States have each of these conditions. So they're growing in number. There's more of these kinds of disorders that we didn't used to know about. And these folks who have these rare disorders can't get treatment. Where do you find someone who has a particular type of condition and nobody, that only a few people know about? Try getting on Social Security if you need that, or try applying for voc rehab with a disorder that no doctor in your county has ever heard of before, but it's real to you. And so this rare disorder thing is coming, and I'm rambling.
No, it's fine. There's a question in the back. I just want to make sure we get to
Yes, please.
I really liked what you said about disability and identity, and I wondered if you would comment about self-advocacy and the meaning of organizations now like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and the value of those movements.
Sure. So the question is going back to kind of the importance of disability identity development. How does that link up with self-advocacy and organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network? Is that a fair restatement? So yeah, I mean, the autistic self-advocacy world tends to prioritize the concept of neurodiversity, and they don't limit it to autism like they would consider bipolar disorder to be a form of neurodiversity, although I don't hear it used as much in the mental health world as I do in the autism world. But I think part of their preference for identity first language versus people first language, they like to say they're autistic or autistic people versus people with autism, is that they're proud to be autistic and they're trying to create a space where other people can be proud to be autistic and not see it as a negative or see it as inherently limiting. And I think it's intentionally radical. It's like somebody saying, I'm queer, get used to it or whatever. I think it's healthy. I mean, there's fights in the autism world, as I'm sure you've experienced in Kentucky, where you have parents saying, well, yeah, you are a Harvard Law grad who's autistic. My kid, is nonverbal and, is injuring themselves and whatever. And how can you see any connection between your reality and my kid's reality, and your whole concept of neurodiversity is not that helpful for my kid. So I don't know that we're having good bridging of those fights. The fights are going on. They're pretty ugly. I'm not seeing a lot of bridging of them. But I do think that the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has taken the concept of self-advocacy to a whole other level. There's no other self-advocacy organization in Washington that's in the IDD space that has anywhere near the clout or capacity as the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And they have like 7 staff, but they're brilliant and they're doing good work and they're making relationships and they're having an impact. So I'm hoping that the self-advocacy movement over time will have more capacity, not just in Washington, but at the state level and at the local level. And we'll all learn something for what's working around the autistic self-advocacy world. I think that one of the hard things is that the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has not done a great job of hiring people who have autism and intellectual disability. So they tried to hire Liz Weintraub, who works at AUCD, who has an intellectual disability, and she turned them down. But it's hard for people who don't live with intellectual disabilities to claim to speak for people with intellectual disabilities. And I think what the Autistic Self-Advocacy Center would say is, well, we're more connected to them than a parent who has no disability. And I think that's fair. But I think they're going to have to find a way to integrate people with autism and intellectual disabilities in a much deeper way in their movement in order to have credibility when they try to speak for people with intellectual disabilities. And I don't know that they're as aware of that as they need to be.
It's a great example, really, of an emerging disability that is emerging, whether you look at it in terms of gaining new understanding on the part of professionals, whether it's an incidence prevalence kind of thing, or whether it's the kind of attention that's being drawn to the cause, as Andrew mentioned. So across our definitions, here's kind of an ideal example of an emerging disability that is going to continue to gain more attention in a way that's, they're approaching it in really unique ways from the advocacy standpoint, which is very encouraging.
But Kathy, are you okay if we spend a little more time on this? I feel like we're jumping around, but I assume you're okay with it?
I've kind of thrown my questions away
Okay.
at this point,
All right.
so yeah.
So I just want to spend a little more time on this because I think it's really interesting. So self-advocacy is a term that's not used very much outside of the IDD space. So I'm a disability leader. In my mind, I'm not a self-advocate. I haven't used the term self-advocate to describe myself. It's unclear to me in the IDD space where it's used most often, whether it's really referring to people with intellectual disabilities who are also advocates, or it's referring to people with all types of intellectual and developmental disabilities who are also advocates. When somebody say we need some self-advocates or we need to hear from self-advocates, in my experience, they're usually talking about people with intellectual disabilities. It becomes kind of an alternative way of referencing that population. And I remember when I came to AUCD, I told Liz Weintraub, who's on our staff, who was working 10 hours a week. She's now working full-time with an office with a window, and I think is having an amazing trajectory in terms of her career. But I told her that I had bipolar disorder and that it was a disability. And she had a really hard time understanding me as a person with a disability because she had an image of disability that came out of the IDD space. And in her mind, if you went to Yale and Stanford Law School and competed successfully to run a network of academics, there's no way you could have a disability. Like that just didn't equate for her. But part of that is because she was given a definition and a concept of disability that, again, was trying to draw a line. These are the serious disabled people and don't worry about the other folks. So again, I feel like in the IDD space, if we want self-advocates to embrace the word disability, we also have to, in plain language and accessible language, help them understand how big and broad that term is and why it's in their interest and to their benefit to embrace the term. And I don't think we do a lot of that with self-advocates. Harold, I know you've thought about this stuff. Do you have any reactions to that?
No, especially we have, in terms of the whole issue of self-advocacy in autism, we really experienced that, that tension. And I was thinking when you said, because I was thinking when I hear self-advocate, I'm always thinking person with intellectual or developmental disability.
Yeah.
You're right. And do we broaden that term out? I was one other thought, and I don't want to take us totally off, but I was thinking this is about emerging disabilities. And there's also those disabilities that may be disappearing. And because we have the ability to eliminate them. And it's just, I was just thinking there's a parallel there, but there's also just like there's some really ethical issues that we have in terms of making sure we get resources to people who have emerging disabilities. There's the ethical issues of when we can diagnose a disability, a traditional disability like Down syndrome in the womb, a society has theoretically the capacity to eliminate that. And there are countries like Iceland and Denmark that has now made that their public health goal.
That was our
So
lunch
We were
conversation.
But I think there's an
No doubt.
interesting.
But I mean, the only reason I'm saying
But
that.
let me
is
just-
It's a parallel on both sides.
But let me kind of
Yeah.
contrast two things and see if we think differently about it and
Yeah.
why.
Yeah.
Okay, so the world came very close to eliminating polio, and this is something that Bill Gates put a lot of money into globally.
Mhm.
And now because of anti-vaccine, whatever,
Yeah.
there's some issues. But let's just assume that was successful. Now polio's gone.
Mhm.
Okay. And now Iceland is getting rid of Down syndrome, and they're getting rid of Down syndrome by doing prenatal testing and having 100%
Mhm.
abortion rate if people get the prenatal diagnosis. Do we feel differently about those two things? And if so, why? I think it's an interesting question. Are there diseases that we would say, yes, it's good for the world for nobody to have that disease? And are there conditions that we would, at least in this room, say it's not good for the world for nobody to have that condition? And why do we feel differently about
Well,
it?
part of it
Yeah.
depends upon your definition of life. And that gets into a really difficult issue in this society, in this society, in most societies. You're eliminating polio, you're eliminating that possibility for people who are alive, for children in the womb to eliminate Down syndrome, you are eliminating them. And so there's a distinction there. Now that gets into some issues that are probably not on Kathy Shepard Jones's sheet, and so but I mean it's kind of like the parallel of emerging disabilities because of the whole notion of how disabilities are changing in our world. That we're seeing emerging disabilities, but we also may be seeing some disabilities certainly and for very good reasons decreasing, and maybe for some other reasons it's a rush to genetic perfection that we will regret someday.
Right, and all I'm saying, I appreciate the distinction you made,
Yeah.
but all I'm saying is none of it is black and white to me. Like I can't say with confidence that it's great to never have polio, or it's great to never have cystic fibrosis, or it's great to never have, you name whatever horrible thing you want to never have. I appreciate your distinction, but even in your distinction, we could get to a point with the science where we wipe out the thing that you're acquiring as an adult in utero. So I don't know. I don't know that it's black and white, at least not for me.
What is pretty clear when you look at research on attitude formation, attitudes toward people with disabilities, the general thought is that for people who don't have disabilities, when they form their attitudes about disability, it tends to be on a categorical basis. You have attitudes about people with certain kinds of conditions. We have attitudes about certain disabilities. They differ. That it's fairly uncommon for people to have an overall disability attitude. You would have an attitude about cancer based on maybe someone in your family had it.
Yeah.
You'd have an attitude about learning disability based on maybe you have one yourself. Thinking about the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, we do a lot of work with. Their abiding mission is we want to end multiple sclerosis, okay? None of the people with MS have any objection to that.
Yeah.
None of the the neurologists don't, the advocacy folks don't. But what if you knew when you have a child and there's a screener, I think is what you're getting to, Andy, you could tell whether your child's going to have multiple sclerosis. We can tell about
Or
Down
have a
syndrome.
66% chance of developing.
And then what do you do? Because we have the technology and the wherewithal to change that. So it gets into values, it gets into right to life, it gets into abortion stuff, but it also gets into this idea when we think about disability. We talk about it in a general context. I think it's really instructive. There's a lot of advocacy benefits to doing that kind of cross disability, but at the individual level, in terms of attitude formation, people are thinking about it, one condition at a time. And I think that speaks to your point here.
Absolutely true.
Mhm.
I'm wondering, I know Stephanie Meredith is in the back and has thought a lot about this, and I saw you got Andy with you, but anything you guys want to add to this?
Well, I do think it gets quite complex, and we had a panel on this at at the American Society of Human Genetics the other week, and one comment that I made that I think kind of surprised the audience is when we were talking about, gene manipulation and things like that. I said, even if we had the capacity to take away Down syndrome, there've been a lot of interviews with parents, and we're talking about not even eliminating life, but as far as gene editing, from that point of view, that there was a survey done where half the parents said they wouldn't want to do that, even with that, in mind. And what my comment was, for Andy, he has, which he hates, by the way. Even if I could take away Down syndrome and say it reduced genetic, first of all, he has a say in, where at what point does the individual have a say in that? But for us also, Down syndrome gives resilience to solid tumor cancers. And in my husband's family, most of them died before 70. And what I told the crowd there is I would choose living with a person with an intellectual disability any day over watching a loved one die of lung cancer. And I think that kind of made them think about that in a different way, because there are some complicated choices that come even when you're looking at genetic editing for disability. Because what you may take out, you may add back in other ways that are more challenging from a humanitarian perspective.
And I think it was President Kennedy who said we need to make the world safe for democracy. I think that's a Kennedy quote. I think it's interesting to think about what can we do to make the world safe for gene-linked disabilities. So is there stuff that we can do from a policy standpoint? Is there stuff that we can do from a social welfare policy standpoint? Is there stuff that we can do in terms of basic education where if it ultimately is about choice, people are making choices armed with real information and are given the time they need to make a choice that they're not going to learn more and then regret. So I feel like the world right now is not safe for disability. The meta message that still exists 30 years after the ADA is that disability is a fate worse than death. I think that's the way a lot of Americans think about disability. And as long as that is the meta message, we start giving people new scientific tools to not have disabilities or not have their children have disabilities, it's going to be very hard for people not to use those tools.
Well, the educational infrastructure isn't in place for people to even understand what kinds of decisions they're making. And beyond that, the ethical conversations aren't happening at a broad public level for people to even understand what
it's very
are for the disability.
It's very difficult. And it's not a position statement at all, but people can choose to terminate pregnancy for no reason. Right? You don't need any reason to do that, right? In most states, you don't have to say why. So you can certainly do it for a reason, how do we separate that out, in terms of that kind of information? You don't need to tell why if you choose to do that, but do we not want to provide information that would allow people to make that choice? It's a case where kind of the science has really our morality and ability to just kind of understand things about humanity and life have been kind of outpaced by science. We weren't counting on having to have these kinds of discussions, but now we have to. And it's really interesting on one level. And it's almost impossible to kind of reconcile about what's the right way to even think about it. But that meta message and whether it's messaging or it's just human nature, people think that disability is such a negative experience until you experience one or until you learn otherwise. We still have a lot of work to be done in that kind of education.
But I really do want to lift up the Letter Case Project, Harold, Stephanie, everybody who's involved with it. It's under resourced, but it's critically important. And what you did at the American Society for Human Genetics, that should be happening at every American Society for Human Genetics conference. So our scientists are not getting exposed to disability rights as part of learning about disabilities from a scientific standpoint. And it's creating deficits in their capacity to talk about disability in a way that's not either reinforcing negative stereotypes or offensive. And we can help scientists get better. And I feel like the AUCD network is very well positioned to do that. But what you guys have been doing for a long time, there just aren't a lot of other people doing it. And it's a problem. We need more capacity to do that.
I think
there was a
please,
comment.
I was
yes.
just gonna say, you gotta train public health epidemiologists in ethics and birth defects and developmental disabilities at CDC. And those are specific professions that aren't so large even as physicians, et cetera.
Yes.
But that means somebody being congressional champions to get money to put into those kinds of education foci for public health
And I think
departments, public health schools, where those folks that are doing the counting and say, we count, don't ask us to do anything about policy because we're just counters. If they don't understand something beyond that, they sit in their Birkenstocks at CDC and enjoy doing their analysis.
I'm not quite sure how.
I didn't know about the dress code, but yeah. I think the flip side, I think, Andy.
They are very
Yeah.
comfortable, as is their work. Very.
But I think it might help if you unpack that. I just want to understand. I get like why a physician is important when they're introducing somebody to the concept of disability, but talk more about why the people counting, are creating part of the
Well, the
problem.
CDC has to decide about muscular dystrophy when they find out. Because there is no cure, do we tell parents in our programs that are across this country around making decisions because of the early testing that's done on infants. So you diagnose something. Do you tell parents? When in fact you can't do anything about it. Those kinds of things, and epidemiologists are the ones having to talk about that and make decisions that nobody outside of CDC much even knows about.
And what are the implications if they make a bad decision?
You tell me.
No, I'm trying to understand it. I'm trying to see where the power comes from the epidemiologist. So if they say, well, because there's nothing to do about multiple muscular dystrophy, we're not going to diagnose it and we're not going to tell anybody.
They are diagnosing. The tests are coming back.
So what is that leading? What's the bad outcome that that's leading to?
It means parents aren't prepared.
Okay.
I think it's I appreciate Andy's point about finding ways to educate scientists about disability advocacy. I think also it's important, the flip side is also true. I think that we as service providers, advocates, have to also understand as much of the science as we can in order to be able to have that kind of discussion. Stephanie, we got to know what's happening, right? When you go to these meetings, you're going and bringing that back, but you have to have a basic understanding of where the state of the science is before you can respond to it, right? So I think it really does work both ways. And I say this humbly, knowing that we're out there trying to understand this. But I think there's a role in both cases. One is to educate the scientists, but also what can we learn from them? And we must stay abreast of what's happening there in order to be able to have as much dialogue as possible, because that's the only way we're going to get there, I'm afraid.
Just one other thing I wanted to bring up. Was there another comment?
No, we're good.
So there's a lot of attention right now to social determinants of health. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, lots of Centers for Medicare, Medicaid Services, lots of folks are paying more attention to that concept. I don't hear people talking explicitly about the social determinants of disability, but to the extent that we're talking about the social determinants of health, the flip side of that is the social determinants of disability. And I think when we think about emerging disabilities, if we don't want physicians to be the end all and be all determiners of whether somebody is disabled or not, it does invite a conversation about how do we make determinations, for what purposes, and to the extent that growing up in poverty generally means trauma, it generally means less access to quality health care, it generally means less access to quality education, you know, all the different things that generally go along with that. Is poverty something that causes disability? And is it helpful for people that grow up in those circumstances to have to carry a disability label with them? But I do think social determinants of disability is an interesting concept. I don't know if there's a literature around it, but I just think it's interesting.
Oh, huge. And the link, reciprocal link really between disability and poverty, which comes first? You know, people living in poverty tend to have a higher incidence of disability. If you don't live in poverty at the time you acquire a disability, you have a better chance of doing it afterwards, you know, because of the impact on employability and employment. So it really, really important, even down to the very labels that we use for two people who have the same condition, depending on what kind of diagnosis they can obtain, what school district they're in.
Or what's
how they-
palatable to their parents.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
The project that we are doing that is talking about public health education in graduate school, there is a question that we're asking that has to do with social determinants of health and disability. And as you're calling and having these discussions with deans or the chairs of the graduate school, they're actually very surprised with that concept, or like, but I'm so glad that we're talking about it, because then they're thinking about, so what are the opportunities and what are the roles that you can include? And most of them ask, there's no literature in that. There is a book that somebody in this room actually showed me. And so I give that to them and I tell them there's this book. So hopefully they'll be researching and just kind of looking, because it's a very interesting way of looking at disability from a social determinants of
Sure.
framework.
And disability, really, the action in disability is not about the label, it's the impact it has on your life. And so that functional aspect there, and that's not really a medical phenomenon primarily. The diagnosis is, but beyond that, how is it really affecting people? And that's where the social construction of disability really factors in, and you can't remove those factors of poverty and other potentially advantaging or disadvantaging characteristics that go along with that, related to gender, related to race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. So disability isn't isolated from any of those other things, and all those other things are part of people's lives as well. And so as it gets integrated and we look at Dr. Bishop's notion of centrality, we also have to look at the centrality of all the other characteristics that people ascribe to themselves.
And Kathy, I'm just wondering, are there questions remotely that we should be paying attention to? Is Walt, are you the one monitoring that?
Yeah.
I am monitoring.
Yeah.
I just sent out I asked if there were any questions online, so please feel free to use the chat box. We have not had any
Okay.
yet, but I've sent the message encouraging.
Is social determinants part of your book? Dr. Williams?
Yeah, it's a huge part of it, and it really is kind of going beyond. That's the whole emphasis, is going beyond the label. Partly because for people with, let's say, rare disorders, some of these folks never get the label. They never get to know what actually is the condition that they have. So it's only about the functional aspects, and only about the environment. We spend a lot of time also talking about environmental aspects and that construction, that, you know, disability is more or less disabling based not so much on what's happening with the individual, it's the environment around the person. We can now create environments for people, and even though we won't say they don't have disabilities anymore, but they're not limited in doing all kinds of things because of the environmental modifications. So we look at social construction in the book. We look at the implications for rehabilitation, counseling, planning, practice, intervention, but those same processes would apply, I think, to interventions in special education, school psychology, possibly to advocacy. We spent a lot of time talking about eligibility determination in this very fact, and that these folks with emerging disabilities often aren't able to get to the medical providers to get certified in the first place, and therefore they miss out on services that they definitely do need. So we talk about the conditions based on the etiology and that kind of narrowly defined definition. And then we try to broaden out to what does this really mean, and that the real action is in the experience that people have with it and the environments they can, that either we as service providers put around them, or that they can put around themselves, or that we can do in partnership, which is really even more powerful. So
Can I ask the two of you an unfair question? So here's
No.
my unfair question. Do you think it's important that people who do research focused on disability either have disabilities themselves or have loving relationships with people with disabilities in their life?
I mean, I think that's definitely would be preferred. I think the notion of systems being able to do that right now, I don't think we're there, unfortunately. And I think that goes back to the whole notion that we need to be doing a better job at the pre-service training level in an interdisciplinary way. But yes, I think it's been far too long for programs, services, supports, all given in the name to people with disabilities, but not being driven and led by people with disabilities. So I would definitely say that.
I don't know, I'm just thinking, like, if I'm a researcher hearing that, like, to me, part of the message that I hear when you say that is that this area couldn't possibly be interesting and valuable to anybody who didn't have a disability. I get kind of the converse message.
Well, and see, and I think that's also a really interesting point too, because I think that also says sometimes for somebody without a disability would be, oh yeah, well, if you have a disability, clearly that's the kind of research you'd want to do.
Right.
But that's not, and that, which is not a good thing either.
we also, I think, have a.
Go ahead, Chairman. I do want to come back to the comment, but go ahead.
I think we also have a probably practical bifurcation in disability circles that isn't necessary, and we ought to work to blur these lines, but between research and advocacy. If you work in disability, even thinking about disability funded projects related to disability, you have to almost identify yourself. Do you know so and so, whatever? No, I don't do so much in the advocacy area. Or do you know so and so? No, I'm more of an advocate than a researcher, right? And so research and advocacy companies sometimes are viewed as like the advocates are not objective enough to be involved in research. Right. The researchers don't get the experiential part of it, and there's no question there's a need to have more researchers at high levels who have significant experience with disability, either themselves or family or some personal agenda that moves them that direction. I will tell you that a lot of the researchers I know who do disability work, who don't have disabilities themselves, do have a personal connection to it one way or the other. Often it's through family. So I see a need for that to keep going. So it's helpful.
The reason I asked that question, though, and I do want to come back to the comment, because I get that it's a provocative question and it might drive people away from our field that we don't want to drive away from our field. But I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about people with lived experience with disability. I also said, or people who have loving relationships with disabled people, which any researcher can develop. Like, that's not a limiting category. And I feel like if you're going to be an expert on urban poverty for African Americans, and you're not an African American who has some connection to it, you better spend some quality time with people in that lived experience, or you're not going to have any credibility. And I feel like in disability, we get away with being experts on disability where we don't spend any quality time with disabled people. And I think that's a problem in terms of informing the research. Harold,
well, I would say it shouldn't be a requirement to enter the field. There are people who including myself, who fell into it.
Yeah, you were called.
And
no, it may have been.
Well, may have been, but
some people feel called.
Yeah, but it's but I would also agree with you. If you're in the field as either an advocate or a researcher or whatever, that your work will be much deeper if you have those relationships. But those relationships may come
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's a
And we definitely need more.
And-
And the other thing I think is involving people with disabilities in the research that affects them. This isn't a new concept, right? This is participatory action research. We've changed the name on that. This is a big deal, and it's just not okay anymore to be studying. Disability can't be an academic exercise. There's too many real issues that people are experiencing, and finding ways to include people with disabilities as full partners in the research enterprise is really, I think, where the authenticity comes in. And that's the bridge from research to advocacy and back and forth that we made some great strides in over the last 25, 30 years, Andy, but I think we still have a ways to go. Sorry, Kathy.
No, I was just going to add to that. And I think the authenticity part of that is really critical, because the other thing that we don't want to say is, okay, oh, you have a disability. Come work with me. I don't really care if you know anything about this. That's not going to help either. That's not a positive thing necessarily.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Phil talked about spread as a negative. So you have one thing and it spreads in a negative way. I've seen the reverse, which is like a halo effect, where if somebody has a disability and they are able to give a really good speech, sometimes people assume that they're ready to manage a $3 million organization and do all the other things because they're disabled and they give a good speech.
I mean,
So-
hypothetically, right? No.
So maybe I resemble that remark, but I do think that happens in that direction too. So
Yeah, it
you're right,
does.
qualifications matter and accountability matters. But Stephanie was trying to say something.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I think fundamentally the ideology of nothing about us without us should apply in all of these different disciplines. So if you are doing research, if you are, writing medical guidelines, you should be getting input from that population. So that requires either a personal or a professional relationship.
Yeah.
And there has to be some kind of collaboration, because for the longest time, these medical guidelines for prenatal testing involved zero input from anyone in the disability community. And so I think that's where, if the relationship didn't exist prior, there should at least be a professional relationship and getting input following.
Yeah, that's great.
And I want to circle back to one last point, talking, it made me think about the whole notion of accommodations versus universal design. And I see this in some of the classes that I teach. And, sometimes at the beginning of the semester, I'll get an accommodations letter from a student and I'll say, I require extra time for testing. And I'm like, well, these tests are untimed. What else you got? I need to receive the materials in alternate formats. I can't just have a PowerPoint. I need to have a transcript. Got it. What else? Well, that's it. Okay. So really, we're talking about everybody really having that
Your
same
standard operating procedures.
Yeah. So it's no longer considered an accommodation. It's just like, wow, this could actually work better for
And
everybody.
the more of that you have in place, it just think of how just the experience of having to go and ask for something that ought to be provided anyway, how intimidating that can be, how stressful that can be, how stigmatizing that can be. You prevent that transaction from ever happening in the first place if the person's needs are already being met. So those universal design, nothing wrong with the principle of reasonable accommodations, but we're cutting down on the need for it in a really good way through universal design, and we should do it as much as we possibly can.
I know we're out of time.
Yeah.
We do have a question from online. The question's from Chitra. How do we advocate for disability as identified the large-scale studies that examine social determinants of health? For example, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation does not include disability as part of the identity question.
I think it's a great question. I mean, my answer to it is to go with Senator Harkin to meet with the head of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which I'm doing in a couple months. So we'll push them on this. I know that they are a huge player. But, I think it's not just Robert Wood Johnson. There's a lot of ignorance in well-educated progressive circles about disability as a form of human diversity. And there's a long history of well-educated progressive circles ignoring disability. I think a lot of foundations historically have seen disability as something that's a waste of money because you're not going to get good outcomes. A lot of foundations are looking for disadvantaged populations they can spend money on and get a good outcome. And they think of us as hopeless. So,
And
it's
the
changed.
opposite is true, actually.
Yeah, and I think it's changing. I think the Ford Foundation is helping to change the dialogue. Robert Wood Johnson is now part of a President's Council on Disability Inclusion and Philanthropy, co-leading it with Ford. That's why Senator Harkin is meeting with them. But my hope is that Chitra's question, when it's posed to them and they're forced to look at it, will answer itself.
And Becky, we can look to the state voc rehab program look at all the data we have on return on investment in the state VR program. Look at what a great investment that is for every successful closure and how much that brings back, not just in the person's own empowerment, but in earnings and reduced reliance on all kinds of supports, lowered healthcare costs, contributing back to the tax base. However you want to do it, we know exactly what the impact is of a successful outcome in the state voc rehab program. We need to get that message to people who, kind of across. We already know how important that is, and we know what a great investment it is, and the outcomes speak for themselves.
And I think maybe this is probably it's maybe the best point to end that we can for the day. My only regret is that this seminar isn't longer, and maybe the next time I'll get to ask my questions. But I hope you'll help thank our presenters and our panelists this afternoon. And I know that everyone will receive an evaluation at the end of the seminar. So if you'll fill that out electronically, it will help us plan for future seminars. And we really appreciate your input and your time this afternoon. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great.